deep inside, there's a huge part of me that's gone.
The horror is once you get out, trying to get back what you'd lost.
When you're on that side of the bars and there's no way, there's no hope, there's no crack, you give up.
Took away a big portion of my life, took away my life with my children.
I mean, what happened to the word investigation?
Helpless, fear, anger, and revenge, and wanting people to be held accountable for what had happened to me.
And why? Why did you do it? What possessed you to play God?
I knew my life was over right there.
Having my family taken away, everything taken away from me.
I had my life stolen away for 25.5 years for a crime I didn't commit. You can't get that time back.
Hi, I'm Kelly Fanson.
And I'm Kelly Lauzon.
And this is Real Life Wrongs, where we dive into the stories, the crimes, and the hard times of the complicated world of wrongful convictions.
Episode 8, Served on a Silver Platter. Highlight case, Guy Paul Morin. Guest, Robert Bloom.
October 3rd, 1984. It's morning, and as usual, you head off to work. The day is uneventful, nothing out of the ordinary. When you return home, you take a nap, and then get to work on some renovations around the house well into the evening. By nightfall, there's a huge commotion at your neighbor's house. Hundreds of police officers, firefighters, and community members swarm the property. You don't know what's going on, and being relatively new to the community, you think it's best to let it be, stay out of it. Over the next few days, you learn that the little girl who lives next door, Christine Jessup, has gone missing, and large efforts are being made to find her. The police work to find any leads in Christine's abduction. Nothing useful has come up. December 31st, 3 months after her disappearance, Christine's body is found. February 14th, unbeknownst to you, you have become a person of interest. It isn't until the end of February, 2 months after the body is found, the police pay you a visit. They're interested in the day of Christine's disappearance. They want to know when you left work and when you returned home. Other than remembering what time you left work, you don't recall anything else in any detail. It was 5 months ago, and it was a day like any other. Then on April 22nd, 2 months to the day of being questioned, the police arrest you on your way to a community band practice. You're charged with first-degree murder of Christine Jessup. Later that night, the police search your home and your vehicle. They take samples of your hair, blood, and saliva, which you voluntarily provide. You're interrogated for 6 hours. All the while, you repeatedly tell the investigators you had nothing to do with it. You don't know anything. You believe there's nothing you've said or could say to incriminate yourself. You were at work. There's no way you can be charged for a crime when you couldn't possibly be at the scene. All of this falls on deaf ears. You're arrested, put in a jail cell, denied bail, and spend the next 10 months awaiting trial. Little do you know, there are some opportunistic inmates who are waiting to sell you out for the chance to get out early. They want out so badly that they'll be willing to make stuff up to make you look really bad. This is the story of Guy Paul Morin, and while we may not often think of Jailhouse Informants as a contributor to wrongful convictions, the use of these kind of witnesses has played a big part in a number of high-profile cases. Today on Real Life Wrongs, we're examining the role of a jailhouse informant and the impact that these controversial individuals can have on the outcome of a trial. But first, let's review the details of the crime.
So 9-year-old Christine Jessup gets off the school bus at 3:50 p.m. Her mom and brother are at a dentist appointment, so she's home alone. An hour or so later, her mom and brother arrive home, and she's not there. Nothing around the house sets off alarm bells. Everything looks normal, except that Christine isn't there. 3 months later, her body is discovered. The autopsy reveals she had been sexually assaulted and stabbed several times. Stabbing was determined to be the cause of death.
So let's jump right in. What or who is an informant? I picture a guy in a trench coat under a street lamp. Or is that Deep Throat?
That's a confidential informant. Usually, an informant is someone who's working with or for the police for some kind of reward. I mean, it can be the street lamp guy, or really anyone who works with the police to provide information.
But a jailhouse informant is someone who is currently in jail.
Exactly. It's basically the same idea, just different logistics.
So let's say you're in jail and your cellmate starts asking questions. You're probably happy to have someone to talk to, but in prison, small talk of this nature is a red flag. See, this is why we can't have nice things.
So an informant would most likely have to take some time to build trust. And yes, their manipulation, including a sense of friendship and understanding, can be very effective in getting you to talk.
So how often are jailhouse informants used?
There's really no way to know. I mean, it's a matter of public record when they do end up testifying in a trial, but we can't know how many times someone voluntarily brings up information with the hopes of getting a deal.
So the use of informants is not new. It dates back to ancient Greece, where they were called sycophants, which literally means people who put forth false accusations or slanderer. But there's a flaw in the cycle. Players in the system who use informants are often not equipped to check their statements for reliability and validity.
Right. A lot of the time, investigators and prosecutors are so fixated on closing a case, they won't take the time to look at an informant's statement closely to make sure it makes sense or that it even matches the case evidence. And sometimes, even the most well-meaning officers and prosecutors might not even see the problems with the account that they're being told. And, I think we can all relate to this because I think we've all been in a situation where we only see what we want to see or we only hear what we want to hear. But nonetheless, because they don't often check how reliable a statement is, the criminal justice system just perpetuates a bunch of problems by using unreliable informants in the first place. I mean, we're officially rewarding people despite the inaccuracy of their information, and we're rewarding them without questioning what their motivations are. And on top of that, we continue to promote the use of unreliable witnesses by providing protection for informants. Like, justice officials are very careful to protect the informant's confidentiality and security. So basically, all of this comes down to promoting a culture that values speed over accuracy.
So is it fair to say that a jailhouse informant is selected by the prosecution?
No, they're not chosen, because if they were, they'd be acting as agents of the state. And when you're being questioned by an agent of the state, you have the right to a lawyer. But if a snitch simply comes forward or volunteers information, then what they have to say is fair game to be used against someone.
So you said snitch. Why would someone come forward with information about their cellmate? Isn't the old saying, snitches get stitches?
I did. And yeah, maybe. But, there are a lot of incentives to snitch.
So if you get us information we can use, we'll knock time off your sentence, give you leniency, special privileges, withdraw some charges, maybe all the charges, or any number of perks that you may be interested in. So knowing this is offered, how effective is their testimony going to be?
Well, according to the Innocence Project, 15% of DNA exonerees had a jailhouse informant testify against them.
So fairly effective. As we covered in our eyewitness episode, the jury loves a confident witness. Jailhouse informants have a lot of incentive to be convincing. In a justice system looking to discover the truth, why take the risk on someone with blatant ulterior motives?
Well, the argument is that they provide a quick resolution. I mean, the information that they're giving you is pretty complete. in the sense that they're giving you a ready-made suspect with details of the crime. And it's time-saving because officers don't have to go conduct an entire investigation to find out what's just been handed to them. And in the grand scheme of things, they're pretty inexpensive. I mean, definitely far more cost-effective than having to do a big, long investigation.
Okay, so surely the defense is prepared to debunk or disqualify and discredit the information. That's their job.
Sadly, what we've learned through wrongful conviction cases is that the deal with the informant is often kept from the defense. And in some cases, what happens is that the prosecutor won't come straight out and tell the informant that they're going to get a reward for their testimony. But I mean, this is the worst kept secret in the world because everybody's aware that this is how things work. But this is like a kind of workaround because when the informant takes the stand and they're asked if they've been promised a reward in exchange for their testimony, they can say no, and they're not lying. It's not perjury. So the promise or the benefit isn't given to them or even discussed until after they've given their testimony.
But again, we all know that that's what happens. That's, 6 of one, half a dozen of another, whatever. But as a jury member, I might believe that that person, the informant, has come forward out of the goodness of their heart then.
Maybe. But, the unfortunate reality is that even when the jury knows that a deal has been struck, because like you said, we all know that this is how it works, the jury still tends to believe what the informant has to say. Even when the informant reveals that they've been given a deal when they're on the stand. Research has shown that it doesn't change the juror's mind. In one study, when participants were asked to imagine being on a jury in a hypothetical case, testimony from an informant always increased the likelihood that they would find the defendant guilty. Even perjured testimony doubled the chances that the jurors would convict.
Wow. Yeah, so wrongful convictions in the making. Let's get back to the Guy Paul Morin case. He's charged, and when Guy's trial finally began, the Jessups had reconstructed their timeline for the evening of Christine's disappearance. It was not uncovered until years later that it was actually the police who had encouraged the Jessups to rethink the time they had arrived home to find Christine missing. With their revised timeline, the window of opportunity for Guy to have committed the crime grew to such a point that he could have done it. On top of this, the prosecution presented some forensic evidence. They had a strand of hair that was found on Christine's sweater that matched Guy's, and they had some microscopic clothing fibers that were found in the trunk of Guy's vehicle, which was supposed to prove contact between Christine and Guy.
But maybe what spelled out desperation and doom in this case more than anything else is the fact that the police relied on the testimony of 2 jailhouse informants to help them build a case around Guy. In their testimony, the informants claimed that Morin had confessed to them. And this is what the police needed. It was the next best thing to having a confession straight from Guy himself.
So they claimed that Morin had confessed to them.
Yes. And they were given a tape recorder to catch the whole conversation on tape. And when they went to present this to the prosecutor, they claimed that, unfortunately, it malfunctioned right at the moment when Guy confessed. But these 2 upstanding citizens swore that this is how it went down.
The informant swore that this is how it went down. But whoops, exactly. Faulty tape recorder. Oh boy. Okay, so while this seemed to be what the police were looking for, what the informants had to say should have been met with much more doubt. I mean, let's consider that they were given a recording device to get the confession. And when they bring it to the prosecutor, they claim that the tape recorder malfunctions. How do you deal with this? Like, how How does the prosecution look at this? And the defense has no idea this is happening. Am I right?
Correct. No, nobody knows that this is going on except the prosecutors and the police. And again, this should have been met with a lot more skepticism, especially when you consider that the two informants had lengthy criminal records and they had this track record of making false claims. And they had even offered to implicate other inmates in the Jessup murder before bringing forward the story that it was Guy.
It's like these guys thought they were playing a game of whack-a-mole. Just keep whacking until you get somewhere.
Like, I'm just going to keep giving names and one of them is going to stick, right? Like, yeah, unbelievable. And, you know, we also might want to consider, and please stop me if I sound like I've lost the plot here, but one of the informants was diagnosed as a pathological liar by experts, and he bragged to several people that he had committed perjury at Guy's trial.
Wow. No plot deviations detected. Yeah, that's just, I think somewhere the plot is lost, but not with what you just said. Like, that's absolutely ridiculous that this would even be admissible.
Yeah. So that was one of the informants. The other informant, he was not really any better. He was diagnosed as having a personality disorder with sociopathic tendencies, including suggestibility and a propensity to lie.
Okay. Is it not the intention of our courts to use the stand as a bastion for the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? I mean, so help me God, you allow a known liar on the stand. What example are you setting?
No doubt. And, you know, this is a great question. And, you know, you had asked if this was, known to the defense at the time. And Guy's lawyer was no slouch, right? And he picked up right away on the fact that these informants were some kind of sketchy dudes, and he challenged their credibility. And, you know, he uncovered a number of investigative errors in the rush to arrest Guy, including the improper collection and storage of physical evidence. And in the end, you know, it probably should have seemed like a surprise judgment. The jury returned a verdict of not guilty, right? I mean, because the Crown thought they had this slam dunk case. So jury comes back not guilty. And of course, the Crown appeals this decision.
And a new trial was ordered. The jury at this trial heard similar evidence about the hairs and fibers that were presented at the first trial, and they heard from our wheeling and dealing informants again. This jury gave more weight to the forensic evidence, and this time Guy was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison.
Yeah, and shortly after that conviction, a group in support of Morin was formed. And they called themselves the Justice for Guy Paul Morin Committee. And what's interesting is that this was the very grassroots beginning of what we now know as Innocence Canada. And you can find more information about Innocence Canada on our website at realliferongs.com. But the group's first objective was to help Guy win an appeal and to apply for his release on bail while waiting for his appeal to be decided.
And due to their relentless charge, they were successful. And despite being convicted of murder, Guy was granted bail. Both Guy and the committee planned on winning the appeal by proving that the hair and fiber evidence used to secure his conviction were not reliable. But they never got the chance to do this because, drumroll, as DNA enters the scene, it's
1995.
95. And DNA changes the world where crime meets the law. The DNA results come back and confirm that Guy was not involved with the crime.
And this was obviously good news.
Okay, but I hear a Lauzon but.
But we have to remember that by the time of his exoneration, Guy had spent 10 years of his life fighting to prove his innocence. And although nothing can ever give him those 10 years back, nor the peace of mind that was ripped from him, he did at least receive compensation.
Okay, so I continue to hear that compensation is something all too often never seen by individuals who have been wrongfully convicted.
True. And so it's a miracle that Guy received $1.25 million and a public apology.
Again, in some cases, there is financial compensation, rare, but it happens. But I also consistently hear, or I've heard you say, that there's never really a public apology.
No, and that's very true. It's a repeated chorus because, we don't want to apologize because then we're admitting we did something wrong. Anyhow, unfortunately for Morin, the exoneration and finding of factual innocence wasn't the end for him. It took another 26 years before the stigma that hung over him would be cleared. And, once again, it was a life defined by the wrong verdict and another innocent life behind bars.
Of course, with Morin's exoneration, Jessup was once again an unsolved murder, and by then had become a cold case.
Yeah, it wasn't until October 2020. So, fairly recently. And this is 36 years after Christine's disappearance. The Toronto police announced that they had identified Christine's murder through DNA and genealogical research. Calvin Hooper was 28 years old at the time of the murder, and he was a friend of the Jessup family.
And although Calvin Hooper was never identified as the suspect in the murder investigation, he was flagged as a person of interest at the time of the original investigation, but he was never seriously considered. So how devastating for the Jessup family that the right suspect was overlooked and right under their noses because of errors like tunnel vision and eyewitness identification, which you can find out more about the consequences of those system errors in our tunnel vision and eyewitness identification episodes.
No doubt. 36 years is a long time to wait to find out what happened to your daughter. And unfortunately for the Jessup family, they're never going to be able to get a full answer to that question because Calvin Hooper died by suicide in 2015.
Well, maybe the truth killed him. So we have an interview coming up with Professor Robert Bloom, a law professor and an expert on Jailhouse Informants. He's testified in numerous cases and has published a number of articles on Jailhouse Informants.
This guy is a big deal when it comes to informants. Pretty much anyone who wants to know what the world of Jailhouse Informants is about, Robert's your guy. And it was a privilege to get the chance to speak with him.
We're in an adversary system. And one notices that prosecutors who want to make their case stronger will search out informants. And there's something called an implicit bias that the prosecutor will believe that the informant is telling the truth. But of course, he has this implicit bias because he needs the informant. And oftentimes, the informant, through lots of means, etc., has information that is not necessarily in the press or anything like that, which furthers the prosecutor's feeling that the informant may be reliable. But he's certainly not looking to find that he's unreliable because he needs the informant to make out what could be a somewhat weak case. You don't see informants being used in stronger cases.
Sorry, we don't see them used in what cases?
Stronger cases.
Okay.
Where they're not necessary. So if they have enough evidence, they're not going to necessarily use informants. Well, first of all, they don't indicate when they're on the stand that it's in their best interest. As a matter of fact, they don't actually get a deal, shall we say, until after they testify. But they're very aware that good testimony will result in getting some benefits. So when somebody went on cross-examination, a defense attorney says, aren't you doing this because you're getting a deal? No, the prosecutor didn't make any promises to me about any deal.
Yet.
But they know full well that they're going to be getting a deal of some sort.
And so the defense may suggest or ask if they're getting a deal. They may say that they're not getting a deal.
Right.
But again, is the jury informed, or is it ever made evident that there in fact is going to be a deal?
The judge, through jury instructions, will often say that you need to be somewhat skeptical of informant's testimony. But other than that, you're not going to, no matter how good a cross-examiner you are, you're not necessarily going to get the fact that they are expecting a deal. And the prosecutor will usually just say, just be honest and tell the truth. And that's all the prosecutor told me to do, was tell the truth.
Mm.
And they'll come up with reasons like, I feel like I'm trying to turn a corner here, and civic responsibility, blah, 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 blah. Some of the studies have shown that testimony by an accused, whether it comes through the accused himself or through the informant, is very powerful. 21% of the exonerations had some informant involved. That might not have been the only reason
for them to be exonerated.
No, for them to be convicted in the first place.
Right. That's right. More and more defense attorneys are asking if they've testified before, and they ask for those records from the government. And the judge initially evaluates it, and with the jury instructions, the judge is often feeling like, I can tell the jury, because the judge thinks jury instructions are great. I'm not sure how much is comprehended. At any rate, the judge feels that it's part of the prosecution case, and he usually lets it in. You're assuming that just because there's been 21% or whatever of exonerations because of informants, some informants might be telling the truth. See, it's not automatically that it's false. Anyhow, when I'm asked to be an expert at a trial and there's an informant, I can never get on the stand and say, I think this informant is lying. That's up to the jury to decide whether or not the informant is lying. Mm-hmm. I can tell a jury, to the extent that they allow me to be an expert, I can tell the jury how it operates, how the system operates, and that an informant honestly can say that there's been no deal because the deal isn't offered, but there's an expectation of nice treatment once they testify. In addition to jailhouse informants, there are co-defendants who get to see Uncle Sam, or I don't know, what would you call the Royal Mounties, I guess. Sometimes I talk about what the person is charged with, or what the person has been charged with in the past, yet he's not done significant time, which could be an indication that he's testified before, although that information is now available. So as part of the cross-examination, usually most people will give it to them. As part of the cross-examination, defense attorneys say, isn't it true that you've testified 16 times or something, whatever? And you've been charged with XYZ offenses and you've only served a total. So lets the jury make their own conclusion.
How do I become a career informant?
First, you have to be in jail.
What does my resume look like?
Well, you've done some criminal acts, I would guess. And you're receptive to not wanting, you don't want to do too much time. So you have been in and out of jail, so you know how the system works. So you might call someone, because you might know a DA or somebody, and you say, listen, I got some information for you. And that's how it works.
You know how the system works, but you also know how to work the system.
Exactly. And most informants have had significant job experience of being a crook. Plus, you find somebody with lots of drugs. I mean, there are all kinds of informants. You find somebody with lots of drugs and they say, you're going to go to jail for a long time unless you tell us who sold you the drugs. So you drop a dime on somebody. You've got a real incentive not to tell the truth.
Should that be the treatment of informants? Is that they're unreliable unless they can be proven otherwise?
No, just the opposite. Although a good judge will determine if this person is an informant all the time, et cetera, and might not allow him in. So a judge might rule that way. But the burden is on the defense to show that the testimony given by a particular informant is unreliable. Now, most jurors don't know how the milieu of jail works and why informants exist. So to the extent that they have more information about that, the better the chances they might be skeptical of the testimony. Experts' testimony, it's been shown by psychologists, et cetera, works a whole lot better than judges' jury instructions.
Does judges' jury instructions just sort of create some sort of low drone? Like, are they just not?
Oh, good. Low drone. Depends on the judge, but a low drone is not entirely inaccurate. Low drone. It's like Miranda warnings. Everybody in the world knows Miranda warnings. The studies that show the comprehension of Miranda warnings are minimal. One of the benefits of lay jurors is that if there's a number like 12 and they can all agree on something, they usually get it right. In Japan, for example, they have mixed juries. So they have 5 lay people and 3 judges. And Japan is so hierarchical, they all listen to the judge. So it's really the 3 judges who are deciding. And usually the chief judge, the junior judges go along with the chief judge, and then all the lay jurors go along with that. So I'm not sure there's that much deliberation. But when you're talking about 12 citizens, I think de Tocqueville said the greatest engine for democracy was the American jury system. An individual might not get it right, but oftentimes jurors don't get it right, but they largely get it right. And most judges would say the same. We don't always get it right. The criminal justice system is flawed. So there's economic injustices, there's racial injustices, there's all kinds of injustices.
Absolutely. So it'll never be a perfect system.
Well, any system run by humans can't be perfect.
Yeah.
Because we're flawed.
Yes, we are. So we're doing the best we can. Do you think that, what's your opinion of, I mean, you're talking about the American justice system, not Canada, but do you believe in the system?
Do I believe in the American justice system?
Yeah.
The part I think that probably disturbs me the most is that if you're wealthy enough to hire a very good lawyer, you're more likely, shall we say, to get off. So I think the economic injustices that exist within the criminal justice system is a concern that I have. And I don't know how to, there's just not enough money or whatever, or resources to not let that happen. But that's a significant problem. And not to mention, the racial dynamic, which is huge. Police officers, law enforcement officers have lots of discretion. So I grew up in a public housing project, and it was interesting for me to see these really bad kids get off because their dad was a policeman.
Mm-hmm.
That's the way it is. The system has allowed prosecutors to have much more discretion with mandatory sentences and 3 strikes you're out. Prosecutors usually are elected, and how tough they are on crime is consistent with getting elected. Jailhouses here in the United States, there are a lot of private jailhouses. They could care less about rehabilitation. They just want to care about the almighty dollar. So there's lots and lots of problems. I'm seeing people who are elected as district attorneys and prosecutors are looking at who makes it in the system and are paying much more attention to more violent crimes as opposed to arresting somebody for things like shoplifting. Mm-hmm. So trying to limit the number of people that get into the system, I think, is pretty important. And then once they're in the system, I'd like to see a whole lot more rehabilitation going on as opposed to just punishment. What influenced my decision to go into law was living next to an Orthodox rabbi who would have his students study the Talmud, and they would have debates about it. And as a 10-year-old kid, he would bring me in, and they would have to all talk in English because I didn't get the Hebrew piece, and ask my opinions about difficult issues. And my opinion was as valuable as these Hasidic scholars or Talmudic scholars, because I was coming with my own sense. So that got me to law. I also experienced considerable prejudice because I was one of the few Jewish families living in public housing. So my first job out of law school, I was a civil rights lawyer in Savannah, Georgia, because I had no tolerance for prejudice. Anyways, I arrived in Savannah, Georgia, and the previous all-black high school had been integrated with the white high school. And Brown versus Board of Education, famous United States case, they said all schools shall be integrated with all deliberate speed. Well, in Savannah, Georgia, the speed was very, very deliberate. Anyways, the home rooms were 60% white and 40% black, Yet the college level courses was 100% white and 0% black. So what can I tell you? Even though some of these, my named plaintiffs, were getting high SAT scores, et cetera, and yet they were in the lowest level English classes, lowest level math classes. Welcome to America. What a country.
Have there been meaningful changes to the use of informants? Like, have we learned anything?
Well, that's where DNA comes in. We've learned that we've learned the beauty of DNA is that now there's specific statistics that would indicate that the system is flawed, that innocent people sometimes get convicted. By the way, the percentage, one of the things that irritates me about the Innocence Project and the DNA, not the work they do, and I'm glad people get out. They don't take cases where there's no DNA, and there are a lot of cases like that. But I will say that oftentimes the criminal justice system gets it right in terms of punishment. It's the injustices when they get it wrong. It's huge. Not all cases is there DNA, especially these days.
These days because we're getting better.
Because these perpetrators come with bleach or whatever and eliminate the DNA. I'm watching too much television, by the way.
I was going to say, and like a lot of your lower level crimes, there's not going to be DNA. There's not going to be DNA at a shop.
They can't afford it, or it takes forever to get the DNA stuff tested, etc. And there's not a lot of money to do that in some communities. You don't want to enter the system. It's not a good system.
Is there enough being done to?
No. To make it a better system? No. I teach this course, Introduction to Criminal Justice, and I had my students did papers, and it was just one student discovered that pregnant women about to give birth who happen to be prisoners are still in chains, which isn't necessarily good for the baby they're carrying, etc. So, I mean, a lot of medieval stuff. I did a gig in Italy, and I went to a female prison, and I was just so impressed that they had like a daycare center right on the grounds of the prison. So the inmates would spend 3-4 hours a day, working at the daycare center, but taking care of their own kids. And I thought that was a beautiful thing. And the kids didn't know that the oldest kid was about 5, and they'd take the bus to the aquarium or whatever. And it wasn't like they were in prison. They were in a good setting. And those kind of things, that's cool.
That's brilliant.
And Scandinavia, most of the prisons in Scandinavia and Denmark and Sweden, Finland and Norway, it looks like college dorm rooms. I mean, it doesn't look like a lousy mattress with one sink and an open toilet.
Is there ever a time when those conditions would be right and would be appropriate? Or does the whole thing need to be discarded?
I don't know. It's, as I say, there are various elements of the criminal justice system, all with problems. So if I were the czar of the world, I would start over, but I'm not. Wrongful convictions only focuses in on the trial process. Doesn't focus in on rehabilitation. It doesn't focus in on police discretion. It doesn't focus in on prosecutorial misconduct sometimes. So it doesn't focus in on plea bargaining. It doesn't focus in on who becomes judges and elected judges. So there's so much more than wrongful conviction. wrongful conviction is just a symptom of a much larger problem.
There are many elements to Guy's case. So did it teach us anything about using jailhouse informants?
Well, after Guy's exoneration, there was a public inquiry called to look into what went wrong in that case. And in the report, Justice Kaufman pointed out that the use of jailhouse informants was an important factor that led to Guy's wrongful conviction. And he made a number of recommendations. And as a bare minimum, he said the prosecutors should be looking very closely at this kind of information. And he went on to say that when presented with informant information, the prosecutors should be considering things like the informant's motives for coming forward, the details that they're providing, and the possibility that, they may be colluding with other inmates.
Yeah, and I think he also suggested prosecutors should be looking into their mental profile. Do they have a history of giving information? Have they been convicted of crimes that should raise questions about their honesty?
Yeah, and I mean, these were all good recommendations, but unfortunately, they didn't stop informants from coming forward, and they didn't stop officials from relying on them to build a case. And in 2000, during the Thomas Sofno inquiry, and you can get the full story on Thomas Sofno in our police misconduct episode. So in that inquiry, Justice Corey went even further in his recommendations on how informant information should be treated. He was blunt. He did not hold back. And he said, and I quote, "As a general rule, jailhouse informants should be prohibited from testifying." But he conceded that there may be times when we have to consider what an informant says, but he laid out strict guidelines for how this should be handled. Things like their statement should be recorded from start to finish. And
like without any tape recorder flubs.
Yes. Yeah, we should, definitely make sure that it's a fully functioning recorder.
We don't use recorders anymore.
That's true. But
the Wi-Fi can cut out.
Yes. Whatever you're using, it should be,
foolproof,
fully functioning.
Yeah.
So we need to record them start to finish. And then the statement needs to be reviewed closely to make sure that the information is genuine, that they aren't making things up, or, they're not just repeating what they heard on the news.
And in response to both of the inquiries, a number of provinces have issued policies and guidelines. For example, the Manitoba Department of Justice issued an in-custody informer policy directive that says, quote, "Except in unusual circumstances, in-custody informers should not be called to testify on behalf of the Crown." Ontario looked at the dangers that come from using jailhouse informants, and this led to new policies, educational programming, and changes to operations. And this was aimed at reducing the risk of wrongful convictions. New Brunswick, Alberta, Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, and Labrador have also made attempts to incorporate the recommendations from Justice Kaufman and Justice Corey into their policies. It actually sounds like, although far from perfect, there have been improvements since like the crazy 80s, which is where a lot of these things seem to have exploded. A lot of these charges that have occurred sound promising, but they also seem pretty obvious. Like, what took so long? And then even still, let's not get lazy either. Jailhouse informants are still used, even though we know there's an agenda, and they lead to wrongful convictions.
Yeah. And I mean, I think you nailed it there when you said, let's not get lazy. For me, the key is not to become complacent. And, when an informant comes forward, this may be the one time that we should be looking a gift horse in the mouth.
Right. And, who doesn't like the get out of jail free card? But you know what card monopoly doesn't have? The who wants to be a snitch card. Know why? Because nobody likes a snitch. The world of wrongful convictions is a living hell for individuals who end up in it. And believe it or not, It could happen to anyone. Know the law, know how to look for flaws in the system, understand how marginalization works, and most of all, talk about it. Thanks for listening. I'm Kelly Fanson.
And I'm Kelly Lauzon.
For excerpts and additional information about our podcast and the world of wrongful convictions, follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook. You can watch video portions of our podcast on YouTube and Instagram. And if you'd like more information, visit our website, realliferongs.com, and drop us a line at hello@realliferongs.com.
All of us could falsely confess to something.
They blew it all out of proportion, and they got away with it.
Even a country like Canada has people who are charged and convicted of crimes they didn't commit.
There's innocent people who are going to die in prison.
I can't get back the time that they took from me.
And I was just left wondering, like, what the hell is happening?
I knew my life was over right there. That's when my life ended.
They're changing the story that I told them to match to what really happened.
I was just incarcerated for 37 years for somebody else's crime.
That what happened to me could easily happen to